I've been asked to do transition pictures for, but was never really very interested in, was a guy called Emanuel Swedenborg. He was an 18th century theologian, philosopher, scientist, engineer. His life was like one of those dials you get on a washing machine. You know, you turn it around, it goes whites and delicates and normal and casual and all those, and you can turn it around. His career was like that. He was always doing one thing or another. He began as a scientist, a really quite brilliant scientist and mathematician. I think he had the idea for a flying machine at one point and also came up with the idea of neurons in the brain and so on. Quite a smart man. And then he moved on to other things and he wrote his own version of the Bible and he started having visions. This was the main thing about Emanuel Swedenborg. He started having visions at the age of 53 and believed that Jesus was talking to him and that the second coming of Christ would not be an actual physical manifestation of Jesus, but would be a message transmitted to the world via Emanuel Swedenborg. He had more and more visions. He wrote a book about the afterlife, which is called Heaven and Hell, where he reported back that he'd been to heaven and spoken with angels who were carrying books and dressed in clothes. And he had all these kind of fantasies, really. Now, as a guy who does these transition pictures, I have no right whatsoever and no credentials for criticizing somebody like Emanuel Swedenborg, frankly. I really don't. But it does seem like a lot of the stuff was a fantasy of his rather than something that actually happened. But we don't know. And he went to his grave believing so strongly that everything he'd seen and heard was absolutely true, that he left people thinking, I wonder if he knew that. I wonder if he actually had been to heaven and spoken with angels. He died in 1772 at the age of 84, having had a stroke the year before. And I think he thought he was getting well, but no, it was eventually the stroke that saw him off, which is reflected in the pictures, actually, because when I went into his energy, he was in a rowing boat. But instead of using oars to maneuver himself along, he was using his arms and flapping them around like that, but backwards, which would propel the boat that way, right? Yeah. So he was trying to go backwards, and the reason was that he was heading straight for a waterfall. The current was pulling him along, and weirdly, for a guy who claimed to have visited heaven and spoken to angels and was okay with the idea of dying, he was terrified of dying. He fought the current like crazy. But only for so long, and eventually he went right over the falls and into a vast cloud of spray. At that point, he thought that was it, because it got so dark as he fell, he thought, I'm a goner. But he recovered, and that's exactly what happened in 1771. He had his stroke and then he recovered. When he did recover, he was on a flat surface and thought, oh, wow, I'm fine, actually. But the surface was at a tilt, and no matter how hard he tried to resist, he couldn't stop himself succumbing to gravity. He was gradually sliding forwards and eventually dropped right off. But he fell really hard. So if he had a heart attack or a second stroke, it was actually quite painful. But it delivered him to the entrance of that tunnel I always see. It's like a little connector between this life and the next one. And this was a fascination of his, actually. It's one of his studies. He looked at the connections between matter on the mortal side and spiritual stuff. This tunnel, which usually is quite short, was a little circuitous, actually. It went around and about as if, yeah, he'd had this painful experience and then he took either hours or days to physically cross over. But eventually he arrived in that metaphorical cave I always see. It doesn't really exist, but it's my way of being able to feel how they feel. His immediate reaction to that cave was, this is all there is? He was disappointed. A little embarrassed, actually. Bashful, like, uh-oh, wow, did I get that wrong? But of course, there's the tunnel, which everybody seems to go up. There's a kind of current that pulls you up there. And as he walked up it, it was very steep. He came to a pretty high wall that it was incredibly difficult to get over, if not impossible. And I remember thinking, oh, this is meant to induce him to let go of his preconceptions. He must have, in the latter half of his life, built up some pretty solid theories and beliefs about what happens to you after you die. And this was all being stripped away. It was as if the universe was saying, for every false belief you are prepared to let go of, I will lower the floor a little. It wasn't really grace saying, I have a wall here that you're not going to climb over. The wall had been erected by Emanuel Swedenborg himself. He was the cause of his own blockage with his entrenched beliefs and imaginings about what happens to you after you die. And gradually that's what happened. The more he was prepared to let these things go, the more easily he could climb up over this obstacle. And then, like everybody else, he's before the light. He's standing there. He was like a bashful schoolboy. It's like, whoops. Really goofed, didn't I? And there is no judgment at this point, save the judgment that you project onto whatever you're perceiving. So he would step into the light, which he did, and go around again and learn more next time. But I went into this knowing almost nothing about him. I just did him from that picture. And I thought he was a man of great wisdom and understanding and knowledge. He certainly was a man of knowledge. But the wisdom, the mysticism, the theological aspects to his belief system were way off, apparently. I've never read his stuff, but apparently they were way off. That's what I got from Emanuel Swedenborg's Transition Pictures.